happening now or later, or is it even going to go? No, it is happening live. Happening now. I've just completely messed myself up. Happening now. We'd like to welcome you to our viewers from across the world in North America. And I'm just going to go off the script all night to the EdTech Situation Room. This is episode 232 for September the 22nd, 2021. We are able to speak the English language here, so bear with us. We're going to bumble through the beginning. But I am Wes Fryer, coming to you from Oklahoma City, where I am continuing to enjoy this extremely expensive piece of earwear, which, yeah, if you're listening to this, you can't see it anyway. But joining me tonight in his flannel, and I'm suspecting that might be because there is some cooler weather in Montana, Dr. Jason Neiffer. Dr. Neiffer, has the flannel come out of the chest of drawers, or is it always readily at hand to grab at a moment's notice in Montana?
Yeah, I will say that one of the downfalls of going back to my physical office, which I did at the beginning of August, to be in a kind of a hermetically sealed cube all day long, is that I was wearing a lot of flannel last year because it didn't really matter what we wore in the era of the midst of the pandemic. So this is I do generally have a flannel at the ready, and it's a little cooler tonight here in Montana. In fact, this morning when I got up, it was a chilly 37 degrees, and so I need to stay warm at night. But yes, the weather is cooling off here in lovely western Montana. But I'm guessing that we're not here to talk about the weather, and I'm guessing that my flannel, although a fascinating topic, is also not the topic tonight. Wes, what is the EdTech Situation Room all about?
Well, we are here to talk about the past week's technology news through an educational lens. Jason and I will oftentimes rant and go down some rabbit holes. We have a list of links, which last week was, as I named it, the Epic Apple Show, because it was about 50 minutes of Apple events. And it may have even inspired participants in our show to rush out and buy things. You never know. But tonight, man, it could be the Tech Correction, the Epic Tech Correction show. But if you want to check out our links, you can find those at edtechsr.com/links. We comb the internets and put together this list of links, which has different categories that you can peruse and contemplate. Hey, if you're joining us live or you want to join us live, that's always fun, and you can give us suggestions on what you'd like us to touch on, because we usually do not have time to get to all the topics. But our Epic Google Doc, which, even though it is literally hundreds of pages long, amazingly continues to work great, and we're ready for it to fail at any time, but it hasn't yet. And as I'm trying to click my link to get down to the table of contents, okay, we're just going to scroll down. Our topics tonight. I know the Tech Correction is one of them, and I know Apple is going to be one of them. We've also got
some Microsoft news,
work-life balance, and space, which is kind of a tenuous one. But hey, I'm inspiring the next generation of astronauts that will see the Artemis program probably land on the moon. Certainly with a robotic rover, but before they, some of them leave middle school, definitely before they leave high school. And anyway, that's what we have tonight. So, Dr. Neiffer, where would you like to begin tonight's inquiry into the tech news?
Well, let's do a couple quick Apple articles. We won't let suck up the whole show this week. I guess I'd start off with Monday. New versions of iOS, iPad OS, and Watch OS were all available, and I had been beta testing iPad OS 15 on a iPad Air 3, and then was upgraded to what they oftentimes call the Gold Master, which is the final version that's released to the public. And so that came over the weekend, and then I received iOS 15 on my phone, and then I noticed some things were wonky on my watch, so I went ahead and updated to Watch OS 8. And we share a pretty good article from 9to5Mac that polls people on what they think their favorite new feature is. But what I like about that list is that you can kind of see the stuff that's probably making the most waves, since it is clearly, a lot of these things are pretty small pieces. But probably the number one feature on their list that I also thought was pretty interesting is something called Live Text, which is a new ability to use your camera to point towards an object that has text on it, and it becomes searchable and selectable. So in other words, if there's a phone number and a billboard, it'll be the first way I would do that. And you don't want to type the phone number in, open up your camera, it'll highlight text. You press on it and ask if you want to dial on that text. It adds a real layer of functionality to, the actual world, which I think is super cool. And then one other feature I've already noticed is Apple Maps are a lot better. And I will say, I still think Google Maps is better here. Unfortunately, Apple lost a bit of credibility with me with Maps when it first rolled out. Apple Maps, and I won't talk about the specific instance, but I actually almost missed a plane because of bad Apple Maps directions. But it seems to be a little bit better too. So I'd start with you, Wes. Have you updated to any of these new operating systems, and what your initial thoughts?
Why, yes, I actually did. Last night I pulled the trigger and upgraded the watch, or the phone first, and the watch. The first thing you notice is Safari, and I guess it's this compact tab something. I don't forget what it's called, but anyway, the link, Omnibar or whatever, the URL link is down at the bottom. I've noticed a few different permission things, popping up and asking. It hasn't been anything dramatic yet. But as is often the case with these kind of updates, it's great to turn to the tech press to filter this and, be able to help us figure out should we pay attention to this? What should we pay attention to this? And so I want to do a shout out. I've almost finished it, to the podcast iOS Today, which is part of the TWiT, or This Week in Tech Network. And this is their episode from yesterday, September the 21st. And it's with Micah Sargent and Rosemary Orchard. And it's called Our Favorite iOS 15 Apps. And maybe I did finish it today. I'm interested in the focus modes. I'm really interested in this from a wellness standpoint. So, I turn my do not disturb on. I, use that, and I'll use that on my computer as well, because you don't want, text messages and things coming up. I recorded a video that it was a screencast video anyway, where my grill, it was for our adult, Sunday class that we do. But anyway, you don't want that. You don't want notifications. Hey, your grill's, almost preheated, or a text message or whatever. So I've just used those, but focus modes allow you to define different kinds of automations and things like that you want to have happen when you're in different situations. You can manually invoke them, but they can also be, spontaneously invoked because of your location, the time, other kinds of factors. So they have an interesting discussion in the podcast about how, well, I think both of them actually, both Micah and Rosemary are ADHD, and just how valuable that can be for them specifically, of, being able to maintain focus. I've enjoyed my Kindle, and part of the reason is it's just less distracting in terms of having apps and everything else. So I think there's something significant here. And as we often do as sort of technology early adopters, which I'm sure many of the folks listening to our podcast are, you kind of dabble with these things and try them, and they're like, yeah, this is a thing. And so I'm going to dabble with that. And I think it might be worth exploring and sharing, with students, thinking about, like, how distracted do you want to be when you're doing a particular kind of studying, or a particular kind of work. You can really control interruptions in terms of what apps are going to notify, the people that are going to notify. It's highly configurable. But it's also kind of complex, and Micah talks about in the podcast being a little bit intimidated by that. But the things they go over are focus modes, FaceTime links, which let Android and Microsoft users that are not on an iOS or iPhone or Mac device, Apple device, connect to FaceTime. I don't see that being very significant. The microphone modes is really cool to filter background sounds at your microphone, but you have to have a fancy microphone. So I don't know if that's going to work for me. The Safari redesign, you're going to have to decide whether to stick with it or not. But the shared with you, this is what I was just hearing actually as I was cooking dinner, apparently is a feature that really lets you, it collects all the links, for instance, that have been shared with you in messages. So it just really helps you contextually find things that have been shared. And back to my wonderful days of visiting Missoula and listening to Jason talk about bear traps and trapping information. That's such a valuable metaphor for what we need to be doing, is finding ways that we are going to be able to get back to information, trap it, and it looks like Apple's really integrating some of those features. I could go on with some other privacy things, but I have a little bit of a day of dabbling, and that's about it. But I think there is some stuff to really be excited about here. And of course, it's free for what? Everybody who's an iPhone 6 user and newer. I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty astounding. So how about you? Any of that stuff whet your appetite to try or to dig into?
It does. Because of how much I use my phone for medical stuff, I'm gonna work on the focus modes down the road, because I already received a couple warnings from those apps that I utilize saying that you need to be careful because you may not get notifications that you need if you set that up incorrectly. So I'll give it a couple of weeks. But I couldn't agree more that it's really important to take these tool sets that I think the phone manufacturers are starting to give us and set them up to help define where the device engages with your life. And I think it'd be very easy to cynically dismiss that no one wants to hear a teacher in your classroom tell students to to put your focus modes or set up your focus modes or do that. But I think the classroom's the perfect place to do that. I also think it's important to model where, if your kids know that you're into technology, your kids know that you're super into your cell phone. I mean, this is a real opportunity, I think, for teachers that are tech savvy to talk about with students that, this is a really cool thing. Chances are your kiddos are probably utilizing an older phone anyways. Luckily, they're going to get this update. But you talk about, I'm making a very big distinction that, from 8 to 3 every day while I'm teaching in this building, I'm going to set a focus mode that tells me that I'm not going to get anything from these social media sites or from these news sites. And my understanding of focus modes is you can drill these down pretty or in a pretty finite way, or finite's the word I'm looking for.
Granular, detailed.
Granular way is the word I'm looking for, in a very granular way, so that you could say things like, don't send me anything from these news apps except for important breaking news, right? Or don't send me text messages except for from my spouse and kids, or something along those lines. And that, I think that's important modeling. And these tools keep getting, evolutionarily better at helping us kind of protect us from our own devices. And that's just going to be, honestly, the way we're going to be able to continue to use these, while seeing the diminishing impact from the addiction and the Vegas gambling machine style high we get when notifications come over, as we've talked about numerous times in the past.
And I think that there's a temptation and a tendency, because it is easier, in the classroom, to just make those decisions for the kids, right?
Yeah.
Hey, phones are up. Hey, check them in here. Hey, put them away. We're not going to use them at all. And it is hard, but I think that it's certainly a conversation we need to be engaged with students in, and we need to find places where that's going to happen. We had a interesting set of conversations this week. We have every 10 years, we have basically an audit of our school, of all aspects of our school. And that was this week. And it was actually postponed a year because of the pandemic. But one of the conversations that we were having in our technology area was how we stopped requiring a technology class at 6th grade. I teach 5th and 6th, and those are the last required classes. You can take electives, but I just really think 8th grade, 9th grade, when more kids have phones, when maturity levels are higher, when social media is even more of a presence and a power, it's important to have these conversations, and it's important to have with adults too. So I saw in the chat that Peggy had signed up for a 4-week workshop on iOS 15. And so actually, yeah, that's cool. It's at iPhoneLife.com. It's a course that she's going to do virtually. So that's pretty cool. The website's iPhone Life. So yeah, free shout out to, not a sponsor, but a Peggy George Geek of the Week coming to you early. So, because it is a challenge, right? How are you going to learn these new things? I think the privacy aspects of the phone, which I've only heard about but not played with, where you can essentially, it sounds like, almost run a Tor-like experience where your IP address is masked and things are routed. It'll slow your connection down, according to Micah. But in terms of privacy, if you're concerned about that, and then also with emails, that the system will be able to generate emails for different things that you register for. And I guess people have been able to do that for a while. Back in the day, Yahoo had this alias thing that you could create that I made and use some of those and still have some things using them. They still work. But that was an address that would deliver to your email, but I think you could track it and see, what happened and who shared it and whatever. So there's some good privacy things that I think, Apple is doing here as well. Nothing that I think is completely earth shattering, but, new features they're adding to, iCloud Plus, but the share, maybe the most practical thing is the sharing. So haven't played with that yet. But I think it is something for us all to think about, how do we continue to learn, and how do we continue to share and do these things, bleed over to our daily jobs and things that we share with teachers and students. Nothing epitomizes the need to be a lifetime learner like looking at the pace of technology change and how many, hey, it's the new operating system, it's the new update to Office or whatever, that's come about, which unfortunately sometimes feels like you're lowering your capabilities. I mean, that's the worst scenario, because you're like, I can't do what I used to do, because it's changed. Hopefully it's going to be empowering and equipping and allow us to do, more things when we want to do more things. Apple tends to do a good job with that. So I'm excited to get to play with that more, and also, updated the watch, and hopefully battery consumption is not going to be, impacted. It's been interesting to see how that sometimes affects, with the different operating system.
I have an early observation about WatchOS 8, and I'm running an Apple Watch 6. So that's the latest model. It's not the new model, which it will be out later this fall. And this seems like it's actually a little better with battery life. And these are not more. I mean, they're about 18 to 20 hour devices. You can sometimes eke more out of them if you put a low power mode on at night. I've had it last a day and a half before when I've had it on lower power mode during the nighttime. But it seems to be a little better. So we can certainly hope.
Yeah. One more quick one that I won't detail it exhaustively, but you had actually tweeted it, Jason. It's from Lifehacker, and it's the 36 best new features in iOS 15. And this is set up. I'm sure if I had my ad blocker off, I would be seeing tons of ads each time I click through, but it's all slides that you click through. And so anyway, this is just a nice visual way to be able to get a quick summary of those. And again, the tech media and tech journalism crowd is great to turn to at times like these, because yes, you could go watch the entire, Apple event, but even if you do, you're not going to dive into that level of detail with all of these things. So good resources to check out.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, where to next, sir?
Well, why don't we talk about the tech correction, at the risk of, maybe talking about it a lot in the show? How many articles do we have? We didn't do
We have quite a few.
numbered
numbered
list
or so.
Yeah, numbered list says, oh, it's through H, so can't tell me the numbers. Does that let us do numbers?
Yeah, well.
Oh, well. Fancy. Anyway, we have a lot. Yeah, there's about 8 or 9. Okay, let's start with the Wall Street Journal. September 17th, Wall Street Journal published I think 5-part series called The Facebook Files. And there's actually a nice video that you can watch, and I started that. That is a summary of this Wall Street Journal investigation. I'll read the headlines of each section and then just kind of give you the summary. 1, Facebook says its rules apply to all. Company documents reveal a secret elite that's exempt. Number 2, Facebook knows Instagram is toxic for many teen girls. Company documents show. And actually, the statistics on that are pretty shocking. I think it's like 2 in 3 teen girls of the study, that they had. 3, Facebook tried to make its platform a healthier place. It got angrier instead. 4, Facebook employees flagged drug cartels and human traffickers. The company's response is weak. Documents show. And 5, how Facebook hobbled Mark Zuckerberg's bid to get America vaccinated. Overall, what these documents paint a picture of is a company that has invested actually quite a bit in doing research and hiring staff to do research and find out what's going on with the platform. And in the face of pretty overwhelming evidence that there's really toxic, bad, negative impacts, they didn't do very much. So it's very indicting and condemning. Will this be another, sort of brick in the wall or chink in the dam or whatever you want to say to try to bring about the technology correction, which, as listeners of our show know, is Jason's term for regulation coming as a result of a variety of factors that are causing people to be upset at what the tech platforms have either done or not done. And unfortunately, the Wall Street Journal is a paywall, right? But I don't actually. This is an article, I think, unless something weird is happening with my connection. This is an article that you can just they've placed it open, and you don't have to have a subscription. And oh shoot, I say that now. Sorry, it's just the overview that you have, and as you click on each section, interestingly, you can listen to the article in 2 minutes, but I'm going to suspect that that's not going to work. You've got to be logged in to see the whole thing. So looks like a good piece of journalism. I don't know that there's anything radically new here. So Jason, is any amount of of journalism like this going to actually push us to regulation, or are these companies just too powerful and the lobbyists too persuasive with their dollars in Washington for anything to happen?
Well, I'd start off with that. I heard accounts of these stories on the way to work last Friday when they were released. NPR had about a 2 to 3 minute article on it, and to be honest, I'm outraged by it. That this notion that Facebook knew by their own internal data and research that things as diverse as it was helping radicalize the population, and that they were able to make Facebook more engaging by serving up increasingly more radical political notions on one end. On the other end, that a third of teenage girls were basically self-body shaming because of things they saw on Instagram. And I think that is really problematic. And it also sounds like by almost every account that they knew this information, but they decided not to do anything about it because they didn't want to hurt their profit margin. And that sounds crass, like that perhaps I'm being too critical, but that's exactly what the study suggested, that it was a profit motive that kept Facebook from dealing with this. And the question you pose, Wes, about whether this is going to lead to some regulation, it could. I don't think that that's going to be good enough, though, right? Like, the bottom line is that in part because of factors we've talked about in the past, that our current load of politicians seem unable to really grasp social media to the point of writing meaningful regulation. But the bottom line is that the evidence keeps getting that much more damning, and I'm saddened, and I'm also a bit mystified on what we do about it.
Well, again, we've got a lot of articles about this. This is one that I saw yesterday from the New York Times. It is titled "No More Apologies Inside Facebook's Push to Defend Its Image." And Facebook is now using their news feed to push their own propaganda. And they are also trying to distance Zuckerberg from, no public apologies, basically taking a much more offensive tone against the folks that are challenging them. It mentions, and we talked about this on the show a couple of weeks ago, I think, how some researchers, I think, have essentially been deplatformed. That's not what they're really calling it, but their access to these APIs that Facebook had created to allow for research, they were taken off the platform, and then they said, oh, well, the FCC says that they tried to use a government order to say this is why, because these people were collecting data, but it was the FCC I think it was the FCC came back and said, no, collecting data, having academics do research to increase transparency for the platform is absolutely not prohibited by our order and past directives. And so there's a real struggle going on. In this New York Times article really, unfortunately, shows, I think, an extremely negative response on the part of Facebook, which is to dig in, be defensive, now use the news feed to push pro-Facebook, articles and things to try to influence public perception in a positive way about Facebook. And, they haven't taken action. That this was the whole focus, by the way, of my, Why Care About Privacy and Surveillance Capitalism presentation last week that I shared as a Geek of the Week. There's horrific stuff that's happened. The genocide and refugee crisis in Myanmar or in Burma of the Rohingya minority, the election, influencing, if not outright throwing, Brexit in the presidential election. That's a highly charged political concept to say. But, undoubtedly, there was a whole lot of Russian interference that was allowed and permitted. And so this article, I think, shows just how Facebook is rotten and the leadership is not responding in a positive way. So I don't see anything here redeeming on the part of Facebook or making me feel, sorry for them or at all just feeling good about them. I'm not, we've talked about this before. I'm not at the point of wanting to quit because I use Facebook all the time and I connect to so many people. So this is the irony of the situation that we're in. They've created a platform that is, too good to quit. We've heard of too big to fail. Well, too good to quit is sort of what Facebook is for me, and I think for a lot of people. But the pattern of behavior that they've had that these articles demonstrate just is reprehensible, without a doubt.
Yep, absolutely. And I would also mention that I'm on Facebook. I know Dr. Fryer's on Facebook. I wouldn't call either of us serial posters by any stretch of the imagination, but we post, a decent amount. But I would say that one of the reasons why I've stayed on Facebook is because I do crave that connection with people that are far away. And that's where not that I wouldn't be willing to walk away, because to be honest, it probably would be better for my mental health if I did. But the bottom line is that I've utilized that connection quite a bit over the last 15 years to stay connected with people that I know and love. And that's the part that really makes this complicated for me, because I see so much value in the connections the tool can bring. But at this point, it's becoming harder and harder to stay connected in that way, without questioning the motives of what the point of the tool is.
So the Wall Street Journal article, the Facebook files I referenced, as I said, is behind a paywall. But I think you put a couple articles in that are not,
Yep.
which key in on a couple of those things. The Guardian's article from September 18th, leaks just exposed how toxic Facebook and Instagram are to teen girls and, well, everyone. And then the Verge article, Facebook VP, disputes report claiming the platform knows about multiple flaws it doesn't fix. I mean, this is the thing that documentation just rejects, right? So you have people who represent the company coming out and saying, no, it's not true. This does not refute evidence. And that's what the documentation is. So,
Yep.
it's just, it is maddening. And I think I mentioned on the show a few weeks back that I had heard Ken Burns on Kara Swisher's podcast talk about how horrible he was convinced Facebook was. And I'm like, of course he didn't tweet back to me, but anyway, I was like, what do you mean? Give the details. I think these articles are exactly the kind of things that are enraging. And I mean, as if we need more outrage. We do not really need more outrage in our society, but goodness gracious, it's just, it's not only something to think about from a policy level, but like looking at that article you put in about how this affects teen girls, like this is important stuff for us to talk about with our family members, with our, cousins, nieces and nephews, whatever. There are powerful psychological effects here, which we are in many cases probably just dimly aware of. But these articles are pretty dramatic. And I think the conclusions of some of these studies are pretty strident as far as the effects. They're not really vague and ambiguous.
Couldn't agree more.
You want to do that Texas terrible social media law?
Yeah, The Verge reported on September 22nd that, so we talk about regulation a lot, when we talk about the tech correction, and the other thing we talk quite a bit about is how incapable we feel a lot of policymakers are to make these regulations, right? And we talked a lot about when tech CEOs were dragged onto Capitol Hill to go to congressional hearings, and a lot of senators didn't even understand how social media worked, or secondarily how it made its money. But as an example of probably the wrong kind of regulation, there is a bill in Texas. It was called House Bill 20, and House Bill 20, according to The Verge, is one of many state-level efforts to make companies like Facebook and Twitter leery of moderating their own content. And this is aimed at perceptions that these platforms are unequally aggressive towards conservative accounts and conservative points of view, as opposed to other types of points of view. And the idea is that if you have a platform like this, you can't censor points of view that you disagree with. And the notion of these laws, and they oftentimes will cite a First Amendment defense, but you don't have a First Amendment right. The courts have been very clear about this. You don't have a First Amendment right to speak on anyone's platform. You have a First Amendment right to speak, and government can't interfere with your speech. But that's really where the First Amendment ends, right? It's an extremely powerful amendment, but it doesn't obligate platforms to carry your messages. And there's several lawsuits actually being waged against this House Bill 20, but a group called Net Choice and the Computer and Communications Industry Association, or CCIA, are the major lawsuit trying to get rid of House Bill 20. But one of the arguments they make is that it imposes an inability for companies that have platforms to censor things they find unpopular, and more importantly, it could force points of view that most people would find repugnant, and say that you have to allow these points of view. And the ones that the Verge article talks about are pro-Nazi speech and terrorist propaganda. And before or people fly to conclusions that that will never happen, and clearly there'll be other factors there. These are some very fine lines we're drawing here between what is acceptable speech on someone else's platform and what is not. So any thoughts here, Dr. Fryer?
Yeah, I mean, I think back to the school focus, we need to be talking about what free speech is. There are lots of misconceptions, and these misconceptions have been pushed by groups with different kinds of agendas. I think I've mentioned it, and it is a not safe for work. Don't have the kids or grandkids around if you're going to watch all the episodes. But there is a 5-part series on HBO about QAnon, and it is a fascinating dive into a whole lot of stuff, including, some folks that have very radical views about free speech that have run platforms like 4chan and 8chan, these image boards, that have hosted absolutely horrific content. And what some of the founders and people like that will say is, well, I grew up in the United States and learned that everybody can say whatever they want and have a right to, free speech is basically an absolute right that's not bounded. And so we need to, as part of our civics education and as part of our education as critical thinking people, I mean, we need to understand the boundaries of our own freedoms. And yes, we in the United States have some guarantees. We don't have privacy rights yet. We just inferred rights from our Constitution. I mean, we have them in fact, but we don't have articulated, in the Constitution, for instance, privacy rights, and we don't have a GDPR here yet. But misconceptions over freedom of speech are really, really important. And what we're also seeing here, and we're not a political show, but we oftentimes touch on political issues, is we'll sometimes see politicians do things that they may realize, and their legal advisors, I think, may realize this ain't going to fly. This isn't going to hold up in court, but they're still doing stuff to try to, gain the approval of voters and, for purposes other than enacting the change. And so perhaps some of this fits into that category as well. Peggy had put an article that I put up there from platformer.news about these research scandals being different. I had not seen that article, but we can include that one in the show notes. Let me say something else about Facebook and actually tech companies more generally, and then a little bit about Google, because the tech correction is not all about Facebook, although a ton of it, focuses around there. This is a really cool podcast network, and I almost could have included this as a Geek of the Week, but it's called the Scholars Strategy Network. Connect with scholars on research, and this was their September 8th episode 228. It's called The Past and Future of Big Tech, and it is an interview with Margaret O'Mara, of the University of Washington. Her most recent book is called The Code, Silicon Valley and the Remaking of America. This is a fantastic look at the overall arc of Silicon Valley, Fairchild, I think it was, semiconductor. And there's this perception within America about Silicon Valley, maybe it's worldwide, that these companies have just been allowed to be free and to not be regulated, and that's what's caused all this innovation. Well, actually, Silicon Valley has been heavily invested in by the government and by the defense industry, and the way in which we had Moore's law and what's happened with microchips and all this. So it is a really, really excellent deep dive into not only, as it says, the past, but also the future of big tech. So that's a great podcast that you may want to add to your podcast list. And then to move beyond Facebook and talk a little about Twitter, Ars Technica had an article on November 18th. Google is getting caught in the antitrust net. One case in Turkey cuts to the heart of the search giant's power. And the case here is arguing, and Google, they have actually been ruled against multiple times now in the European Union and in different countries, but saying you can't just favor your own Google search results, for instance, when people search for local things like restaurants or whatever. And it points to the fact that search engines like Google, but companies who are providing internet service, run the risk today, and maybe it's not even run the risk, it's a reality of having to comply with different laws in different countries. And, in some cases that may mean turning services completely on or off. We talked on the show in the last month about Australia and the way their law was threatening to lose Google entirely. Microsoft was excited. Yay, Bing will take over Australia. But it had to do with news and the cut of money that news organizations and agencies got. So it's a pretty fascinating article. It's very complex, and the fact that this is the interesting thing about the internet, right? It's a global network, yet we have sovereign nations that have their own sets of laws that handle things differently. And we have a number of countries, and of course they're watching each other to see, what's effective, and politicians are, jockeying to see what they need to support in order to, garner votes. How do we stick it to these companies? And, hopefully in a less sort of cynical view, hopefully it is about supporting consumers, supporting citizens, supporting rights like the right to privacy. There's a lot of other things, obviously, that are at play here. But let's not make the mistake of thinking it's all about Facebook and their, errors and misshapen ways. Google is a huge player here, and Twitter is as well. And I thought that was an interesting article that would be, interesting to discuss. We've got our juniors, all of the juniors at our school right now, doing a unit on big tech, and I'm excited to see what kinds of projects are going to come out of that in terms of inquiry. There's so many different directions and ways that can go, but we may be sitting here waiting for the tech correction, but it's happening now in other countries. This is a worldwide phenomenon, not something that's just limited here to the US.
Absolutely.
All right. I guess we could skip the last one. Anything else you'd like to say, Dr. Neiffer, about the tech correction tonight?
Well, the discussion's ongoing, and stay tuned.
All right, there you go. Should we talk some Microsoft?
Sure. I didn't read very much into detail about this when it was released, but this week Microsoft had an event, and they're continuing to offer their own hardware, which, by the way, I think has been very good for Microsoft. I have generally been impressed with the innovation of their hardware, and although I do not perceive myself to be a consumer for example, their 2-screen Android phone, because that just looks like something that I would break within about 72 hours of owning it. But for their Surface tablet models, really interesting stuff going on in that arena, and I applaud them for going in that direction. There is a new Surface Pro 8 that's available. I believe the other one that's similar to that is a Surface Pro X, if I remember correctly. Yep, that's correct. But probably the most interesting piece of hardware, in my opinion, is they do have the Surface Book, which there's 3 generations of the Surface Book. In fact, I used a Surface Book for a while as part of my day job a few years back. But now they're replacing the Surface Book with something called the Surface Laptop Studio. And Microsoft's had a really interesting run the last couple of years with large touch screens that creators can literally grab and bring towards them, and utilize both a Surface Pen, which is a pretty interesting piece of hardware that comes along with a lot of these Surface devices. And then also they had a little kind of rotary dial that you could put on the screen and access different commands, and very useful for a lot of the different drawing and graphics applications. But now they're releasing something called a Surface Laptop Studio, which is a metal laptop that looks like the other Surface laptops or Surface Book laptops, but it essentially allows you to fold it into a tablet, or you can kind of bring it closer to you, all of the big Surface devices, to be able to utilize a pen and ink more with it. And of course, these devices were all featured with the upcoming release of Windows 11. And I like this hardware. I think it's good stuff. I'm always a little terrified with these kind of tablets that don't seem like they have a whole lot of protection on them. And you're carrying around in your bag, and I'm a little personally paranoid about that. This is my iPad Air 3, and I want a case that held the pencil on there, because otherwise I'd lose the thing, because I know myself pretty well. But you'll notice I have a variety of cushy padding on here, that these padding layers allow me to feel safer, carrying this device around. So, I guess I know that you're probably not in the market for a Surface device at this point, Dr. Fryer, but put on your IT hat if you can, blow the dust off of that and put that back on for a couple of minutes. Anything here you might want to roll out to a school?
We did in February, before the pandemic and the lockdown, we did a visit to the Dallas-Fort Worth metro area, including a visit to a school that is completely, Microsoft based. And it was one of the most impressive high school math lessons I'd ever seen, using OneNote and everybody on a Surface. Very, very seamless. And it was amazing. I mean, I'd never seen a math teacher using technology in that way, in a very fluid and seamless, let's all write on our devices with no problem, and let me, share this with you and see what you're doing live. And, it was just super, super impressive. It was actually at an all-girls school. The best quote from that article, which I scanned, I didn't read the entire thing, was from Microsoft CEO. Do you say his first name Satya Nadella? I'm not sure how to say his first name.
I think it's Satya
Nadella, said this: technology for technology's sake serves no one. We must advance both the frontiers of technology and its impact on the world. Okay, that sounds like a CEO. But listen to this. I love this. And there's some nice, I don't know what the word is for, it's a little irony here. Double entendre, maybe. Ultimately, though, we build windows for you, so you have the tools to dream big and turn those dreams into reality. We're excited to see what each of you will create with these new devices, and how together we will shape the next wave of computing for everyone. I lament that our Microsoft store closed here in Oklahoma City. It was just down, in the same mall, a few doors down from the Apple store. I kind of think they might have closed a lot of them. I don't know what their strategy was.
I think it's all of them. I think the model is done.
Yeah, because it was a sales model. It was a marketing model more than it was a sales model. But it was a really cool opportunity to put your hands on these devices, and a lot of the marketing that they were doing. I mean, we think about Microsoft being office productivity and sort of, spreadsheets and documents, but the turn to art, the way in which the Surface and the pen, can open up these possibilities. As a related aside, our Dell Chromebooks and the $25 styluses that we have, best one I've ever used on Chrome. It's great. I've been sketchnoting with my kids. You can have your hand down on the screen. It's not an Apple Pencil, but that kind of technology is really, really powerful, and it's needed. I mean, you can't do all of your math problems that you need to do in school on a keyboard. You just can't. So anyway, I like the focus on creativity. In terms of school, if this is an investment question, it's an issue of your expertise, of your tech staff. It's an issue of your faculty and what they're comfortable with, and at this point, most institutions have, especially because of the pandemic, invested in some kind of one-to-one initiative. And so the question is going to be, do you just maintain and keep with what you're doing, or is there a compelling enough reason to, get you to leave that platform and move to something else? That was the whole push of the Apple Switcher campaign. I don't really see anything compelling enough, especially because, well, there's plenty of schools and organizations that are fully in the Microsoft and have been fully in the Microsoft Active Directory, domain. It will be interesting if Microsoft at some point can and does push something that really dissuades Chromebook using schools and educators to leave the Google platform. But I don't think they have a Chromebook killer yet, and I think they're competing for a different set of market share.
Yeah.
Even though they've got products like the whatever they call their least expensive $400 Surface Go. They've got the Surface Go 3. I mean, they're trying, but I don't think that it has the overall ecosystem. There's just things have changed so much now where Google is really in the dominant position, I think, in a majority of schools when it comes to email and productivity software. Maybe that's wrong, but I don't know. I guess we should pull up an article and do a little homework and see what that breakdown looks like in US schools today.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, what else?
Well, let me talk about an article here, and I'm curious to hear your attitude about this. This is a Verge article that really struck a chord with me, in part because it has a lot to do with what I've been preaching quite a bit in the last 4 or 5 years regarding technology. So, Monica Chin writes on September 18th that you should not use your employer's laptop. You should have your own laptop for your personal stuff, right? And one of the things that, well, I mean, I'm just going to speak for myself here. I'm not the typical user. I buy a lot of laptops, and I sell quite a bit of laptops too, and I give a lot away, and I give them away to family and stuff. But I like having new stuff to play with. It's what I'm not that into cars. I'm not that into high-end audio equipment or anything. I don't have a super fancy yard or super fancy car or anything along those lines. I like tech stuff, so I always have one sitting around. But one of the things I would be extremely careful about is doing personal work on a work laptop, and it's not just because there could be ways for your district's IT department to track what you're doing, not in a sinister way, but a lot of work laptops are set up to phone home or to monitor what you're doing. And this particular article talks about that, and this is a more or less a corporate America, but I think a lot of these lessons are true. Your employer can install all sorts of tracking software, and there would be no problem legally because it's their laptop and you're using it. And if you use it for personal stuff, you may really get yourself into trouble, because chances are, even if your district doesn't have, especially if you work in a public school, even if your district doesn't have any particular bans against it, there may be laws about, if you work in a public arena, utilizing any public asset for private use or private gain. And so I guess I'd start off with, Wes, what would your advice here to be to, Joe or Susie Q teacher about, when to use their school laptop and when not to?
Well, if you're doing anything that's not for your school, that's for money, then you really want to find out if there's a policy about that and what that is. If you want to err on the side of most conservative, then yes, have a second laptop. Use that one for any kind of teachers pay teachers, or writing that you're going to publish, or anything at all that you're going to do that might, if you have a side gig, do all of that on your own device. I was more aware of this when I was at the university, and intellectual property, like, I've been at a private school. This is my 7th year. And things at our school, I have felt very comfortable, and I honestly, though, I've done less and less, frankly, over the last 7 years, independently than I ever have before. But I've done I went to Brazil, I went to Egypt, I've done a few conferences and workshops, and I do other kinds of teaching, really not for being paid. But anyway, I will look at this article and I'm going to really consider this, especially as I move into my next role. Because here's the thing that we've talked about, and you said this article references it: surveillance, the ability of employers to do really just about anything they want. You remember that article? Gosh, maybe this was 7 years ago, where up in the Northeast, there was an employee who was actually, I think, convicted and put in prison for using webcams to surreptitiously like spy on kids and turn them on when they were like at home and stuff. But we have seen an explosion through the pandemic of surveillance technologies deployed by universities for students. Like we talked about this, is it called Proctorio? I think it is,
Yeah.
which is a surveillance technology for test taking to try to make sure kids stay locked in on their tests, that their eyes don't go other places. And anyway, it's all about surveillance and monitoring. And there are tools now that are built into Microsoft, and I think Google has them too, although maybe you need to be at a higher tier and be paying in order to have these. But you can see things like, hey, who hasn't logged into our Google Suite in a long time, or what kinds of documents have been shared out of our domain, or how many minutes has employee Neiffer been on his computer in the last month. And then how does that stack up? Show me a graph of showing me averages. Who's the outliers? Who's doing more, who's doing less? It is really important to know the kinds of surveillance that we are subject to. Most employers are going to, for instance, retain email for 5 years. They can have different policies, and it depends on the state. But that's typical. Retention on video, where are the video cameras in your place of work? So as more work is moved remote, organizations aided by technology that is more robust and more capable, have ramped up the surveillance that they're doing. So I'll read the article. I think we got to think real carefully. If you are not doing any kind of for-profit stuff on the side, like Teachers Pay Teachers, or workshops on your own, or you're writing books that you're going to publish and sell, anything like that, it's probably not a concern. But it's worth raising. And does your organization have a policy? And if you happen to be at a university or a community college, it's much more likely that they're going to have a policy, because they're going to cover things like, innovation, trademark, copyright, and kind of outline that out. Hopefully your school has, at a minimum, a shared intellectual property agreement where anything that you've created as a teacher, you would have shared rights to be able to take. But in some cases, organizations don't have that, and I've sadly known some people who have had to leave rather abruptly, and they've lost access to some things that they hadn't had backed up, and, they didn't have on their site, or on their own stuff, etc. So, Jason, what are your thoughts on this? And have you run into or know anybody who's run amok of their organization because of this kind of thing? Like, well, did you do that on our device? Well, then I guess we own that, and you don't own that.
I know a lot of second and third hand stories of this, friends of friends that have run into issues. And the other thing that you mentioned, Teachers Pay Teachers, as an example of this. I do know that a lot of software suites that give discounted or free versions to teachers will follow up and likely have a problem if you end up selling those assets for commercial gain. If you utilized a free version or a version intended for education, because those are nonprofit endeavors. And even if you develop the initial materials for educational purposes, if you then turn around and try to make a commercial profit off of it, all Teachers Pay Teachers, you could be getting into a software licensing issue. And companies do go after individuals for those pieces, especially if you end up being very successful. So I think that, I have a personal email window up that's up during parts of the day at work, and sometimes I make medical appointments on my work account, or read the news, or look at a government statistic or two related to COVID while I'm at work. And the bottom line is, I feel very justified in doing that, but I also know those aren't for profit or for personal gain. And so I think you need to be careful about that. And I'm not saying you need to go out and buy a $2,000 laptop every 2 or 3 years. But if you're a Google person, having a personal Chromebook that you can have, maybe the majority of your time you spend, if you have a nice work laptop, utilizing the work laptop. But when you're doing stuff that is personal, that you want to stay personal, I think you're better off utilizing a personal device.
2 additional thoughts. I've mentioned it on the show, and I had put it on Facebook, and I posted something cryptic this week with a chessboard, a little Lord of the Rings quote. The board is set, the pieces are moving, and like some people thought, oh, Wes has a new job. I do not have a new job. I actually haven't had an interview yet. I've just put an application out there, but um, as we transition in jobs and things like that, it's important to know about Google Takeout, which is a service that you can have that can allow you to export your Google data. It can be a little overwhelming as far as all the data of all the different services, but it is possible for you to set up a second account and then have the IT administrator send all of your mail and then all of the Google documents that you own, not the ones in shared folders, but the ones that you own, into that account. And thinking about sandboxing things and separate, that's how I'm thinking about, my transition now in less than a year, I anticipate, is doing that so that everything's not commingled with my main Google account, but I'll have a separate, consumer Gmail account. You got to think about storage, and you may need to purchase some extra storage to have all the gigabytes of stuff, depending on how much you've created and how much you own. And
Yep,
then the second thing
absolutely.
that I would mention that I think is really important, and I don't know that I've ever said this on the show and how much this is talked about, but in terms of personal devices, we all need to be really careful with the degree to which we allow students and others to potentially have access to our computer and to our personal devices. One of the things that we did when I was technology director was try to have, a screensaver with a lock code come up after a reasonable amount of time. I'm not talking about a minute, but after, 5 minutes or 10 minutes of inactivity, because there has certainly been a number of cases we've heard about through the years where teacher walks away from computer, possibly steps out in the hallway, students step up, the grade system is there, they're able to make changes to the grade book or, have access. And then there are also there's potentially problematic stuff if you would let students handle your phone and have your phone. And so, yes, phones have stopwatches. Yes, they have, recorders and different things like that. But I think that in the whole idea of sandboxing our lives, in addition to thinking about the work that we do, handing students only a student device. And thankfully at our school, as I probably mentioned, we all got new Chromebooks for middle schoolers this year, and every teacher got the same student device, which is configured as a student device, so we can log in and use it. But this happens not on a daily basis, but a couple times a week, where a kid, their machine goes down. Sometimes it's been with Minecraft. We have to power wash it. It's like, here, just, use mine. But I'm handing them a student device. I'm not handing them my computer. I'm not handing them a computer that I've logged into my stuff with. So all of that is really important. So, Jason, I think we've managed to talk for 58 minutes, if you can believe it. I mean, we've done it again. I'm not sure how it happens every
And
week.
only
Somehow.
like 18 minutes was about Apple, so I think we can hold our head.
Hold our heads high.
Hold our heads up high tonight, Dr. Fryer.
Okay. Well, hey, what is your geek of the week this week?
Yeah, I have a really interesting piece of software that I've adopted recently. I'm back to Macworld after spending quite a bit of time. After I lost a personal MacBook Air several years ago, and now with M1 World, I'm back here, and I've started utilizing more graphics software for things like modifying vector images is something I'm able to do now. But the problem is that Adobe licensing is an ever-changing feast of options, and sometimes they go into my favor and sometimes they don't. And the current access to Adobe software I have only allows one device access, and doesn't transfer to others. There's no home version of it, and there's no home licensing. There's no cheap options to get that licensing. So the Affinity Suite is you buy it in the App Store, and it has an InDesign clone, a Photoshop clone, and an Illustrator clone. And clone's not the right word. These are full featured suites that are intended to be always chasing after Adobe, but instead are excellent suites in themselves. And if I don't want to try to move my license around, or for a personal device, when I'm using, for example, I've got a Mac Mini at home now, and my work one doesn't have a license anymore to install that at home. These three software suites are great, and they often make them half price. They're just $50 a piece. That's not a yearly price. That's a lifetime license to this. But I think right now, and they have been for the last several months, down to $25 a piece. And what's nice about that is that I can just install them from the App Store, so I don't even have to sit around worrying about the install, because if I wipe my machine, as I'm prone to do, or move to another one, it's just easy to download and do them again. So that's the Affinity Suite.
Awesome. I had no idea that existed. So I'll just do a quick shout out to a set of articles we didn't talk about as articles, but space, China just returned astronauts from a 3-month mission to space. The New York Times today just posted a tour of China's future Tiangong space station, which is pretty freaking amazing. And then I gave a link to the NASA Artemis program videos. I introduced this to my kids today as a Wonderlink. None of my kids knew about Artemis, which is NASA's program to land on the moon, and is well underway. And my 5th and 6th graders are gonna see this happen before they get out of middle school. So very cool stuff there. My gig of the week, though, is from the U.S. Department of Education, and it's called a Digital Literacy Accelerator. The webinar that's going to give more information about this is something you can apply to do, actually happens tomorrow. So hopefully you're seeing this live if you're going to be catching that, but I bet you don't have to necessarily see that, and they'll probably record. You have to apply by October 7th, but this is a project by, again, the U.S. Department of Education, seeking to promote an informed, thoughtful, and engaged citizenry, looking for innovative ideas that increase, quote, digital literacy, promote civil discourse, and combat misinformation. I'm actually thinking about maybe the conspiracy theory unit that I've been teaching. There's different milestones that you have to meet, and you can be given in prize money like up to $2,000. But it looks like a really cool way to amplify ideas that get at some of the things we talk about here on the show around media literacy, which is we need to be informed about these things. We need our students to be informed about them. And it's really not just students, right? Because our polarized society has impacts, in tons of ways that certainly affect schools. But part of what we need to do is promote civic dialogue, listening to each other, not shouting, and eventually, hopefully, finding ways for these tools, to not promote a hyper-polarized society where so many people shout at each other and don't listen, and we end up with different sets of facts, which really make democracy hard. So I thought that was really cool. I'm glad to see our Department of Education pushing in that way. And if anybody ends up applying or doing something with that, let us know, because this kind of thing is exactly the sort of digital literacy and media literacy type of initiative that I want to be a part of now. And as I look to the future at possibly, returning to higher ed and being an assistant professor, I'm really interested in. So, Dr. Neiffer, when you're not here enlightening us and showing off your hair to the world, where can people find you?
Best place to find me, Twitter, Tech Savvy Teach, where I like to tweet about mostly tech news and engaging with others like Dr. Fryer.
Awesome. And I am W. Fryer on Twitter. You can visit westfryer.com and click the contact link for more channels than you probably want to connect with me, whether it's barbecue cooking or talking about media literacy. So you have been listening to the EdTech Situation Room, episode 232 for September the 22nd. We thank Peggy George, as always, for being in our chat room and giving us great links and great ideas. And it's just fun. So join Peggy and join us if you can live on Wednesday nights. We're here at 8 p.m. Mountain, 9 p.m. Central. Check out all of our links at edtechsr.com, where you can also download small 16 kilobit MP3s and handbrake compressed almost 100 meg versions of our videos, which also are on YouTube. And you can always follow us on Twitter. And if we are making a change to our schedule, as we sometimes do, Twitter, as well as our Facebook page, are the places to find that out. So Until next time, we encourage you to stay savvy and stay safe. And hey, the next time there's a global pandemic, you too might want to forego cutting your hair. If you want to see what that looks like, tune into the show live next time, or just watch one of our recordings recently.